Professor David Lampton has just moved over from being Director of China Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He has now joined the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford. His research is currently focusing on China's development of high-speed railways in Southeast Asia, and this is what our discussion with him focused around. But we also discussed the previous French and British attempts to develop railway infrastructure in this region in the 20th century, in what was, perhaps, a fitting prelude to China's own development in this region.
David Lampton. I was head of China Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS for 20 years. My interests have been wide-ranging over my career. My first book was on the politics of medicine in China, and then a long phase on water planning and management in the Yangtze River Valley. The inspiration was a book that a guy named Selznick did called TVA and the Grassroots. He wanted to understand how you can understand politics in general and politics in the U.S. by looking at how Roosevelt built and managed the Tennessee Valley Authority. So I tried to do something like that for the Yangtze River Valley Authority and lived in China. Then I took a break out of academia and for 10 years headed the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations in New York. It was a leadership exchange organization, and in that capacity ran into a lot of leaders like Zhu Rongji and Jiang Zemin and Li Peng and a whole cast of characters. And in that role had to become very conversant, obviously, in U.S.-China relations. And so then when I came back to academia at Johns Hopkins, where I stayed 20 years, I kept my interest in domestic politics, but also wrote a lot on Chinese foreign policy and U.S.-China relations in most of my major books. And then my last book was back to leadership. It's called Following the Leader, and it's based on interviews with then it was 558 interviews with Chinese leaders of various sorts, trying to see what governance of China looked like from the eyes of China's leaders. Not that that was the only way to look at it, but it was a pretty good way to look at it.
And something that you've told me you're working on at the moment is China's high-speed railway.
Right. So this sort of gets more back to domestic politics in some sense, but of course I'm merging my domestic politics and my international politics because it embraces 8 nations, building connectivity between southern China and Southeast Asian countries on the continent and Singapore.
What are these building of these high-speed railway lines doing to address the massive Asian infrastructure gap that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, you'll read a lot of reports that, and of course there's a lot of, in the West and in Asia, skepticism of BRI. Is Xi Jinping over-promising? Are these well-conceived? Are they economically viable? All those debates exist. But I would say, I think Western analysts are underestimating the degree to which China's making progress, and that we are going to wake up with a higher degree of connectivity that China is able to mobilize to its own development than we're expecting. I think we're missing an opportunity. So China's already digging tunnels and will be and laying bridges for a rail line that'll run from southern China to right near, Vientiane. It's now negotiated with Thailand, and most people don't, I think, realize how far their negotiations are with Thailand. Thailand's already got the right-of-way for it, so you could be looking at by 2025, a railroad to Bangkok. And there are other lines to the east and west that are being contemplated through Burma in the west and through Vietnam and Cambodia on the east. They all are in different stages of thinking about this, and Vietnam's quite resistant to the idea. Burma oscillates but is resistant. But I think you will have a line to Bangkok by, let's say, plus or minus, probably between 25 and 30, just to be really conservative. And also, China was quite far along negotiating with Singapore and Malaysia until a recent election. And now Mahathir is trying to renegotiate the terms of actually two big rail lines. I believe speculate, that he will probably, or his successors, reach an agreement.
And of course, this sort of...
From Kuala Lumpur to Singapore. That still leaves open what goes from Kuala Lumpur to Bangkok.
Are the Japanese constructing another railway?
Right, but that's to Chiang Mai, and it hasn't started, and it has its problems. One of them being Japanese price.
Focusing on the benefits to the local economies, and of course there's also been questions raised about the financing of these lines and how the countries are going to be able to afford them.
Right.
Can you see these railways as creating a form of dependence, or even them being a type of debt diplomacy, as some analysts have argued, or do you think it's less malicious than that?
Well, first of all, you maybe take the case of the Sri Lanka port, Hambantota. I raised this. I said, boy, to a Chinese person, you guys are really smart. You loan all this money, it's unsustainable, you take over the port. And their response was, and remind me why it's in our interest to have a port that has no traffic going to it, which was why it was unsustainable to begin with. And remember, this is a sovereign country. We don't necessarily have naval visitation rights, or that's negotiated with a sovereign country. And also, you can get expropriated, and we're taking on a lot of political risk in very poor places. So we haven't been attached, China, in his view, weren't attaching due importance to all the downside risks. So we Western analysts look at this debt trap diplomacy as a way to strategically push out. It, in a long run, maybe it would have some of those effects, but there are a lot of risks, both financial and political risks. And don't forget, and this is where I said it, international relations meets domestic politics. People in China are asking, why is Xi Jinping going all over the world promising 60 billion every stop? And we are investing, in the CPEC and all of that. I mean, the Chinese have been killed in some of these areas that are unstable. But the point is, China has domestic needs for education, demographic aging, its own infrastructure. Much of it's already aging, and some of it wasn't even built that well at home, right? You've got an aging population and all of the kind of chronic medical care and all of that. So there's a debate going on in China itself. How much of our money should we be devoting to what they see as foreign aid? So I would say we are very attuned in the West to what we see as China's strategic gains, but it's accumulating a huge amount of political risk, financial risk, and domestic opposition. So I think, you can't just paint straight line pictures that what's going to happen here. So I think the Chinese are taking on a lot of risk, and that means to me they are going to become more selective in what projects they do. And that and the risk can include environmental and all those other kind of collateral infrastructure-related considerations. So I don't mean there are no problems, and there are all the problems you identified, but I think the Chinese are coming, the more they do these things, to see the downsides. And I think that was one of the motivations behind AIIB, was to get more financial participation by more people and more international standards. Now, that vision competes with this bubble up, the entrepreneurial companies, as somebody told me. The Chinese will say, let's sign the deal and we'll take care of the problems later. So there's this kind of spontaneous combustion, unregulated, entrepreneurial, Wild West behavior that comes from the bottom up. But I think the top is trying to exert more risk control here.
If we could draw maybe a historical parallel, the French and the British during the colonial period were looking at building railways in Southeast Asia, and perhaps also we could look at the transcontinental railways of the US in the late 19th.
Well, those two experiences are radically different.
Of course, I mean,
yeah. Like it worked for us, and
well,
it didn't work for the French and the British.
Can you see any historical parallels, maybe if we focus on the experience in Southeast Asia with what China is doing now with constructing railroads?
Well, yes, at one level, and I do in the book have a whole historical that goes back to the British and the French, and you have to add in the Japanese, incidentally, because in World War II they wanted to build this Pan-Asia Railroad so they didn't have all their shipping getting sunk by submarines. But the long and the short of it is the French never made any money. It was a huge, I mean, if you looked at it as a financial, it was a huge, and the British didn't either. So they were vanity projects, and the idea was that you would open up potentially rich areas, Yunnan and Sichuan would open up, and you could come up that way, and you had the British and the French colonies, and so you could, there was all the coastal development and treaty ports along the East Coast. But this was an idea of developing inner China from up through the underbelly. And great concept. I think now, the French, you could say, were 110 years early. Right idea, wrong era.
Gerald Chan, who's a professor at Auckland, did a TEDx talk in, I think it was 2005, and it was about China building a global network of high-speed railways, a sort of a transcontinental network which would link across the Bering Strait and link the whole world. Do you think that this is a fanciful vision of sort of China's motives with these high-speed railways of providing global connectivity and human-to-human interaction?
Well, I think it's time frame, and of course we don't know all the intervening technological developments. But if you had, in what year did Wilbur Wright and Orville and Wilbur Wright fly at Kitty Hawk in the early 1900s, right? And if you said we're going to connect, and the biggest industry in the export industry in the United States, industrial export industry is going to be Boeing aircraft, and we're going to have planes flying double deck, discharging 400 and some people as the big Airbus does or whatever. You would have said out of your mind, right? Okay, so do I think that a world of connectivity by rail is something like that? I think it could be. I don't know what intervening technologies might give us alternatives away from that, but I think, but how fast you get there, and there's going to be a lot of things. I mean, if like Trump, and if we, what are we calling this now, disengagement or deconnectivity? I mean, if that's the wave of the future and we retreat into balkanized economic and regional units, then that future won't. But if we continued on what looked like the path of globalization, reduced travel barriers, I mean, Brexit is a bad sign for this vision, right? So do I think it's inevitable? No. Do I think it's likely, like over 50%? Maybe, but certainly not sure. And I can see lots of things that would derail it, but I don't think it's nuts. If that's...
But you don't necessarily think that's China's motivation, though?
I think China, well, first of all, what is China? I mean, who are we actually talking about here, right? There are a lot of different views. There's Huan Gong that's got these kind of views. He's under heavy criticism for being unrealistic, being a kind of great leap forward mentality kind of guy, and so on. So you've got a huge, who is they? But if you ask what I think the center of gravity of a kind of consensus, at least in the sort of planning universe in China, is that China's growing economically with the right policies, and there's debate over what the right policies are, but continuing to enhance productivity through science and good economic policy. If that happens, then China will grow, and China will have to offload, move up the value-added scale. It will have to offload its production abroad, low-end production. It will build value chains, and China's objective should make ourselves the hub. As Huanggang said to me, all economic roads are leading to China. And I think that's an attractive vision to Chinese people. Now, how it'll unfold, but China wants to be the hub of financial and economic flows. And it's building the sinews, I think you used that word, to make that possible. And that's a better vision than I can see we have. I mean, I don't even see we have a vision, right?
And railways, as you've said, is of course a way to increase trade links and transportation efficiencies, but it's also a way in which power can be projected. And
sure. That's why the Vietnamese don't necessarily want to connect that closely to China.
Can China's plans to build these railways in Southeast Asia be seen as a way of undermining the sovereignty of the surrounding nation states?
Sure, many ways. First of all, you can do it just by the terms on which you build it. China's extracted from Laos all sorts of side payments and commodity barter arrangements and God knows what. We don't even know. A lot of times the agreements aren't even transparent as to what's in them, right? So certainly, but isn't that what Trump is reacting to here? Is we've joined all these multilateral arrangements and we've lost our freedom of maneuver. He doesn't like treaties. He doesn't seem to like allies. He doesn't like the UN. Anything that impinges on treaty. Well, interdependence and globalization are all about limiting, in some sense, some of your areas of freedom so you connect to others and you have a sort of frictionless interaction. That's what the British don't like about, or the Brits that don't like the EU, is it's too frictionless, right? We're getting all these immigrants, right? So so I think if you think we're in a kind of dip in our tolerance around the world for the downsides of globalization, but that eventually we'll get back on track, if you sort of had that view, which I think is, well, it's my hope. Then I think the Chinese are on the right side of history. If we're retreating to balkanization and at every border there's a hard break, but I just don't see the world being able to support the kind of populations we're going to have with such an economically unproductive way of organizing ourselves, right?
If we can look back at the high-speed rail, there's a difference between high-speed railways, which mainly transport people and tourists, and freight rail, which brings goods and commerce. Of course, China is working in expanding both of these technologies. Can you see any parallels between these two different modalities?
Sure, and one of the big item, I have a little chapter in my book on negotiations. One of the big negotiations, I think in Southeast Asia, the average train speed is 30 kilometers per hour, right? So if you say, well, it's only 160 kilometers an hour and the threshold for high speed is 250, then yes, you're at slower speed. But the slower speed they're talking about is 5 times the average that exists now. So first of all, negotiate and the infrastructure requirements as your speed goes up, you have to have more solid foundations, heavier duty everything, lower or more fine tolerances because you're going at higher speeds and all this. So there's a whole spectrum of what they're building. But even, and part of the negotiations, the Chinese generally would like to have show projects where they're 250 and up per kilometer deal. That's their opening position. The other's saying, well, wait, 150 is just great for us. And also, then you've got freight versus passenger. And of course, freight in general is slower, and therefore it does. And also, you don't necessarily want to pay to move heavy commodities. Pay the price. I mean, there's higher electrical consumption, and everything goes up with high speed. So, what China's doing is working with these countries like Thailand. They had a single gauge system, and it was 1 meter. The tracks apart 1 meter. And Thailand's building now double track for freight. And then if the Chinese line comes through, it'll run parallel along the same, and that for high-speed passenger. And then, so each country has its own initial starting position, its own sunk costs in whatever infrastructure it has. And so every one of these countries is a negotiation over speed, passenger versus freight, how are we going to get the railway right away, how do we acquire the land. Each country has different land laws, and some are military governments that have more clout, and some are civilian governments that can't command people what to do. So, so everything's a sui generis, practically, negotiation. See, but the point is that the Chinese are flexible. They just want to, they're like Donald Trump. I want to do a deal.
And just to finish then, if you were able to summarize the Belt and Road Initiative, or at least the grand vision of the Belt and Road from the Standing Committee or Xi Jinping in Beijing, what would it be in an image to you, or a word?
Well, I'd sort of say growth through connectivity is sort of what I'd say.